question. They are selling shares of their company, but they're doing it through private rather than public offerings. So the way the next domino is once you realize you're selling a security, Section 5 of the 1933 Act requires that that security be registered with the SEC. Now, again, for Theranos and HeadSpin, these things are not registered. I mean, they're not publicly traded, so they're exempt from the registration requirements. But that said, what is that they are selling securities and then therefore need to tell the SEC that they have this exemption, usually through some sort of a private offering of their shares, which is exactly what happens for a number of these privately held companies. There are investors involved, usually through some sort of Reg D or other private offering. That doesn't mean they're not trading in security. The reason that that matters is that the anti-fraud securities law apply no matter what type of security is, meaning whether it's publicly traded or held. So for both Theranos and HeadSpin, we see situations where the allegations by the SEC are those of fraud. And so Section 17A of the 33 Act and Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 34 still apply in situations here. As we know, it's those provisions provide that if there's any sort of scheme or artifice to defraud in connection with the purchase or sale of any security. And that doesn't delineate between public securities versus private securities. So that big stick that the SEC has. And then in the case of 10B, there's a requirement, which means deceitful intent. So that's also when the DOJ can get involved with a criminal type of action for the same activity. You're right that this is, there are a lot of reasons a company doesn't go public. There's less regulations that apply. There are not the requirement to do periodic. There aren't, a number of the other cumbersome responsibilities have to abide by. But that doesn't mean they are completely exempt of the securities law. So that's where we get into with both Theranos and HeadSpin. Both of these situations, we see allegations of fraud, charges, or at least a civil complaint about Section 17A and 10B5. So that is obviously nothing new. That's been the case for decades. What's new, though, is the amount of money, I think, that is now only in privately held on publicly traded securities. So with that burgeoning amount of sort of difference between money is and how much is held privately, there I think are concerns by the SEC that they need to really be using these provisions to go after fraud in companies with much more information or disclosure about, because they aren't required to give investors and the SEC these periodic reports. So here is, the SEC is not going to back down from bringing fraud charges against privately held companies. It's only going to increase given, as I said, the nervousness or at least the concern, I think, of the agency that so much is happening in that privately held arena. And there are so many investors, so much money in that space that they will have to very much be policing it. So that's my 2 cents on that, and like a quick overview of securities law.
So, Karen, we had comments as recently as this past week by Chairman Gensler, really echoing some of your remarks that he believed greater oversight in the private markets was called for. And with the amount of money that is being put in private markets as opposed to the U.S. public markets, it certainly seems that Chairman Gensler is concerned about this. And would that really also support your thoughts that the SEC is going to be more aggressive on this?
Absolutely. I think that's where, like I said, the trend has been that's where an unbelievable amount of money has gone. I think Allison Leach, a commissioner, made an important speech that actually had a really interesting historical background of where the split between the amount of investments in private and publicly held companies how that has shifted from the 30s and then to the 60s and now, and how Congress has increasingly relaxed the disclosure amounts and the ability to be raising money in a private sector. That has led to this burgeoning of private investment. But when you think about the purpose of securities laws, is to protect investors, and the way they do that is to require disclosure through things like a prospectus or periodic reports. So it starts to and really, I think, push the SEC to say, hey, we have a lot of people putting a lot of their money in a place where they aren't promised a lot of disclosure necessarily. And so in order to protect investors, in order to protect potential volatility in the market, or sort of protect against volatility in the market, I should say, they're really going to be looking hard at private equity and privately held companies. Whether that leads to more and different regulations. You see the beneficial ownership statement this week and a few others where it does look like the SEC is going to try to figure out if there are additional regs or regulations they can, that they can put in place to police that space more efficiently.
Karen, if I could turn to the HeadSpin enforcement action, because it had a couple of unique factors. And perhaps the most unique was that there was zero financial penalty or profit disgorgement required on HeadSpin. And I understand that every enforcement action stands on its own with its own unique facts. But we had a former CEO who actively engaged in creation of fraudulent documents, fraudulent or allegations of fraudulent misrepresentations, and a whole host of other nefarious activities. But the company was very aggressive in their remediation in one area, and that was reimbursement to those who had invested in the company, whether that be a cash reimbursement, whether it be additional shares. So I wanted to maybe ask, do you recall seeing an actual enforcement action where there was zero fine or penalty? And is the SEC really trying to send a message by making this so public?
That's a great question. And I think that is why this has garnered. I can't think of a time when the SEC has brought enforcement action with a penalty or fine. And so it's an interesting. They had aggressively attempted to, at least the board of directors removed immediately. They revised their valuation, and then, as you said, took pretty extensive efforts in order to repay investors. So it's not something seems more than other companies maybe have done in terms of remediation, and that obviously was what the SEC acknowledged and maybe wanted to, almost provide a little bit of the carrot here. If you do these efforts, if you make these strides in terms of remediating, maybe the role of the SEC isn't one to add a punishment. But I can't think of another instance when this has happened. I can't imagine this is going to necessarily be an indicator that will be how the SEC operates in the. But I think it's a great example of the company really taking some serious efforts to show that they. And so the SEC, allowed, stepped away a little bit from some of their more aggressive penalty phases. It is interesting, especially given that the division of the director of enforcement had said expect some higher penalties. We thought we would see a very hard charging SEC under this administration. And so to see this example of them acknowledging, that, if you make good efforts on behalf of the company in order to fix some of your problems, we will honor that. So I think this is a very interesting situation.
So Jay Rosen, we had a report entitled "The Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking." Oh, Jonathan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to say with the HeadSpin case.
We can barely hear you, Jonathan.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
No.
Okay. Oh, you can come back to me later then, Tom. I'll fix this.
Well, Jay, while Mr. Marks sets up for his question, what could you tell us about the report, or rather, Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking report?
Thanks, Tom. So as you noted, the report dropped on Tuesday, and If you've been watching TV for the last several years, or if you read the newspapers, you know that the United States is facing a cross-border illicit drug trade that contributes to, unfortunately, the premature death of tens of thousands of Americans each year. Some 100,000 Americans overdosed and died, the majority due to synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, over the last 12 months. These fatalities have increased steeply in the past few years. An early number suggests that deaths due to synthetic opioids will have hit the highest numbers in history in 2021. The overdose crisis in the U.S. claims more lives each year than firearms, suicide, homicide, or even motor vehicle crashes. This is one of our most pressing national security law enforcement and public health challenges. Cumulatively, since 1999, drug overdoses have killed approximately 1 million Americans. That number exceeds the number of U.S. service members who died in battle in all the wars fought by the U.S. In just 12 months between June 2020 and May 2021, more than 100,000 Americans died from a drug overdose, primarily among those ages 18 to 45. These alarming statistics are more than just numbers on a page. They represent devastating losses to families and communities, including personal losses to members of the Commission. Whether measured in lives or dollars, the United States drug overdose epidemic shakes everyone. The president declared the illicit drug trade a national emergency and a December 15, 2021 executive order extending his predecessor's declaration that the opioid crisis is a public health emergency. Mexico is the principal source of this illicit fentanyl and its analogs today. In Mexico, cartels manufacture these poisons in clandestine labs with ingredients, precursor chemicals, sourced largely from the People's Republic of China. Indeed, the trafficking of synthetic opioids offers a more profitable alternative to heroin for Mexican drug traffickers. The Mexican government, in part out of self-preservation and in part because of a trafficking problem transcends current law enforcement capacity, recently adopted a, quote, hugs, not bullets, unquote, approach to managing this transnational criminal groups. So what's changed? The shift from prescription opioids to heroin and then to synthetic opioid has proved deadly to people who use drugs. Because fentanyl is much more potent than heroin, imprecise dosing and a lack of quality controls increase the risk of fatal overdose. The bottom line is that fentanyl is undeniably extremely dangerous to people who use drugs acquired from illegal markets that operate with little transparency or care for consumer safety. Here's some new challenges. The emergence of illegally manufactured synthetic opioids has complicated existing supply and demand reduction efforts. It is essential that policymakers understand these challenges. Here are some other things to think about. Illegal drug manufacturing has become easier to conceal by moving from the field to the laboratory. Serious geopolitical issues significantly impede action to disrupt supply. The pull of demand continues to drive the supply of synthetic opioids. External factors, including the coronavirus disease, the pandemic, have driven increases in substance abuse. And overall, synthetic opioids offer economic and tactical advantage that allows the criminals to vastly outpace enforcement efforts. Here are new challenges for a new response. The United States must develop a more unified central body to coordinate planning, implementation, and evaluation of all drug policies. The U.S. must disrupt the drug supply through targeted oversight and enforcement. We must make public health demand reduction approaches central in our fight against opioid trafficking to reduce the number of potential buyers. The United States must collaborate with other countries involved in the production and distribution of synthetic opioids. And the United States must improve surveillance and data analysis to allow for more timely and effective intervention. To accomplish these goals, the Commission has developed 21 key actions supported by 76 enabling actions that address the most salient and actionable charges that the United States faces today in combating the flow and use of illegally manufactured opioids. Here are 5 pillars of the U.S. response to illegally manufactured synthetic opioids. Pillar 1, policy coordination. 2, supply reduction, 3, demand reduction in public health, 4, international cooperation, and 5, research and monitoring. In working towards the end goal of reducing the unprecedented number of drug overdose deaths in the U.S., the Commission recognizes the need to act across several policy domains, both domestically and internationally. A unidimensional focus that ignores international partners and institutions will limit the possible success of U.S. actions. Given the gravity of this crisis, new approaches, additional resources, and a reconsideration of ongoing interventions are essential. If such steps are not taken, the economic costs will continue to rise, and hundreds of thousands of more Americans will perish from preventable drug overdoses. In June of 2021, President Biden delivered a speech entitled Memorandum on Establishing the Fight Against Corruption as a Core United States National Security Interest. If one reads his speech in conjunction with Deputy Attorney General Monaco's keynote address at the ABA's 36th National Institute on White-Collar Crime, and now adds the finding of this report, we start to get a clearer picture. 3 different initiatives, 3 important initiatives in which we now need to appeal to our global brethren. This is our call to action. The challenge will be, can we successfully move the international community to help us begin to combat this domestic scourge? Or will the world turn a blind eye, say this is a U.S. problem, and allow our enemies to tacitly kill off another 100,000 of our drug-addicted citizens without barely lifting a finger? Only time will tell.
So, Jonathan Marks, you obviously have talked about internal audit for quite some time. And what I wanted to ask you for this podcast is, what about continuous monitoring or continuous controls monitoring in the internal audit world? But before we get to that question, I think you had a question for Karen. So you want to start with that and then talk to us about continuous monitoring?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Well, unfortunately, we still can't hear you. Yes, and demonstrating once again the live nature of our performance, we have performance music, courtesy Jonathan Marks. Jonathan, do you have a question for Karen?
Yeah, Karen, in the HeadSpin matter, one of the things that I noticed is when they were talking about remediation, I think they actually they mentioned the word, which doesn't really come out too often, is governance. So I'm just wondering, in the Caremark cases that we saw, it was sort of, it really wasn't mentioned by the regulators. It was mentioned by the courts. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing this word governance pop up in the light of remediation with the SEC and the like. And I'm just wondering, if you believe that that's a trend that we're going to continue to see going forward.
That is a great question. And, I have to say, I don't know if I caught that as much as I recognized that even in the press release, they did say, they mentioned that the board of directors conducted this investigation, and they mentioned that the board was the impetus for all of those remedial efforts. And so that's correct. That is a governance question, and one that I think is an interesting one. And maybe you're right, that might have also lent itself to why they were so there was no fine at all in this situation, because they were acknowledging that the board did everything that it could once it was faced with the facts of what was going on there. But I do think, we'll see that a lot more. I think there is for sure going to be an overlap between the Delaware type law of Caremark and looking at what directors are doing, and looking at that as applied to compliance efforts, and certainly compliance efforts after the discovery of some sort of fraud or other nefarious seeming activity. So that's a really great catch. I think we will see that going forward.
Jonathan Marks, you when I met you literally 10 or 15 years ago, you were one of the first people I met who talked about continuous monitoring in not only internal audit, but internal controls. And I know it's something that you have written and talked about over the years. How can you, or how can a compliance professional or an internal audit professional think about continuous monitoring in the context of an overall internal controls program or a compliance program? Well, we lost your audio again.
I think in order to really, in order to really understand continuous auditing and continuous monitoring, and they're different, by the way, and I'm not going to get into all the subtleties of why they're different, but they are. But to really understand this whole concept of sort of like continuously being in the game here, you have to really go back and look at what the regulators are looking for and what your compliance program really should be functioning like. And for example, we go back to feedback. And when you're getting that feedback, are you using that feedback in order to enhance your compliance program? And feedback comes in many, many, many forms. Formal continuous auditing, continuous monitoring program set up, right? And you can have that set up in high risk areas or other areas of risk. But the more important thing there is really understanding what the objective is. What are you trying to get out of this? What risk are you trying to monitor? And then using that information, that feedback, to enhance your compliance program going forward. So, when people set out to develop these, continuous or ongoing, monitoring programs, most of the times they don't understand the barriers, obstacles, and hurdles that are in front of them when it comes to developing a program like this. They also don't understand the time, effort, or energy that it really does take in order to put a program like that in place. So there's a lot of seeking to understand, a lot of thoughtful application that has to go into this. But more importantly, and I say this all the time, if you have a program like that and you don't have a way to take that information and that feedback and pump it back through your compliance program and make sure that it does, not all the time, not every single time is the information that you get going to shake left or right. Other times it may affirm certain things that you believe, but sometimes it's, but if you don't do anything and that information sits there, or I call it the Marination Effect, and God forbid if something goes wrong and the government finds out that you had this information sitting there and did nothing, that's probably worse than actually not putting a continuous auditing or a continuous monitoring program in place to begin with. Because the fact that you had something and you sat on it really does not bode well, in my mind, from a regulatory perspective. And so, and continuous auditing and continuous monitoring is not just an internal auditor's game anymore. It really does. I mean, I hear more and more from compliance professionals, and we talk about this all the time, is how do we get a handle on the risks that are within our organization? And it's not just risks at the end of the year when we do our risk assessment or when something horrible happens, but how do we get in front of all of these things? And it is a fight, it is a battle, and it does take some discipline, and it takes some discipline through the entire organization, through management, compliance, internal audit, legal, the legal department, all working harmoniously together within the enterprise ecosystem, so to speak, in order to ensure that you do have a program that is meaningful from start to finish.
So, Jonathan, in terms of the improvement, I had the opportunity to interview one of Jay's colleagues, and she talked about internal audit functioning, looking at the controls, seeing whether there was override of controls, seeing whether controls were circumvented on a fairly regular basis. She advocated it, or had done it actually, quarterly, rolled up into an annual report. Is that something that you would advocate? And if so, at what cadence would you suggest internal audit look at controls?
Well, again, circumvention or override of internal controls, I've actually written and published on that particular article, that particular fact. But, going beyond that, when you're looking at controls or you're monitoring controls, the cadence in which you monitor them, maybe, it all depends on, every organization is different. It doesn't have to be quarterly. It could be monthly. It could be weekly, depending on the risk that's involved. I think the more important thing here is that you're getting out in front of these things and you're being proactive. So identifying risks, again, GRC is a waterfall concept. Good governance leads to good risk management. Good risk management drives the compliance program. So if you understand what the risks are within your organization and you wanted to monitor some of those key risks, depending on what the nature of those particular risks are, and depending on the industry or the space which you live in, some of those risks might have to be monitored on an ongoing basis, because daily they could really impact you. Some of those risks might have to be monitored on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, maybe semi-annual. I mean, it all depends, Tom. So there is no one prescription here for any of this. I think the bigger thing here is really getting everyone off the dime and moving this forward and saying, hey, it's just not acceptable anymore to look at controls at the end of the year and test them to see if they're working. There has to be a program in place to ensure that they're not only designed appropriately, but they're operating effectively. And the operating effectively part, will really tell you whether that design is appropriate. And design changes depending on the nature of the business. It also, people change within the organization, mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, things like that could change controls. So all these things come into play. So, you have to be just a little bit smarter today than you were before with controls. It's not just designing the control, it's designing the control appropriately and effectively to whatever the objective might be. So if the objective is, to prevent somebody from doing something, and the fact that they're overriding that, you have to understand, sort of cause and effect there, or the root cause. Why is this happening? Does it mean that our systems are not right? Does it mean that, we don't have a second review in place? I mean, there's a whole host of reasons as to why these things are going on. Is it a cultural issue where people just don't care about controls? No matter, kind of what you put in place, they override them. So, I know I'm going far down the field here, when it comes to talking about monitoring and cadence of controls, but it really does involve, a thoughtful approach. And it really does depend on the nature of the risk, the nature of the industry, and to a big part, the culture of the organization.
So, Matt Kelly, I have to introduce this topic for you. Number one, I've been following Matt's writing for many, many years. And this week he had two of his very best blog posts I've seen, particularly part two. I thought it was absolutely great, Matt. It brought together concepts you've been talking about literally for years. Plus, he's actually exercised on this topic. So I can't wait to see what Matt might have for us on Joe Rogan and Spotify.
Yeah, so I think, going to turn my fire to Spotify, partly because until recently, I really know much about exactly what it was, other than I know he was a comedian. I know he is a podcasting personality of some renown, and I know that veered towards a lot of right-wing stuff on his podcasts, and genesis of the problem for Spotify. 31st, Rogan had an interview with one Dr. 3 hours talking about COVID vaccines. Malone is a well-known anti-vaxxer, an all-around quack. And so he went on Joe Rogan, was 11 million listeners to his spouting all sorts of nonsense about just actually or else that we've all heard from the anti-vaxxer. That podcast led several hundred doctors to write an open letter to Spotify saying, yo, company, you have to rein in the disinformation is pumping out on his. They paid Joe Rogan $100 million for the exclusive to broadcast his material to all of the Spotify listeners out there. Their letter that was in January. And then my favorite wrinkle of this is that Neil Young, the musician, 76 years old these days, and what most people do not know about Neil Young, because he got polio in the year before they invented the polio vaccine in the 50s. Neil Young saw that controversy and then announced to the world and to Spotify, you can have either Neil Young or Joe Rogan. You cannot have both. Take Rogan and his material down, or Spotify did nothing. So Neil Young pulled his music, including and another one called India Irie. I'm not familiar with her, but this became quickly a big mess for Spotify that I think really says a lot about your ethical duties around your third parties. And also, I think about the internal speak-up culture that can frankly get out of control at companies. And that can be a good thing. So
here's what really happened here that caught my eye,
is
that all of this started to snowball.
along comes
Daniel
Daniel Ek.
promised about, I think, 2 weeks
Weeks ago now, he promised Spotify was going to test, quote, ways to highlight our platform rules in our content and creator and publisher tools to raise awareness around what's acceptable and to help creators understand their accountability for the content they post on our platform. And it's the there and the our that really got me annoyed, frankly, that there's a lot of work that those words are doing here, trying to
responsibility off of Spotify. Because in the very next breath,
as talking about the importance of accountability, Eck also said in this memo to employees, it's important to me that we don't take on the position of being content censor. Now, let's all take a pause here, just because I am sick of having to clarify this. But there is no such thing as censorship in the corporate world. Corporations, governments censor. Thousands of
two people
by the pocket to go around.
where the word comes from,
It
means the government from speaking at all.
Not even that the government later on for something you said. That isn't censorship either. Censorship is only the government saying this illegal idea, this verboten thing. Companies control their content all the time. It's called editing, being responsible for the material. So
What really agitated me about Eck
is here he is throwing out these trigger words like store and silencing and slippery slope, which is exactly the phrases that he used in his memos to employees, all basically get to the point that he doesn't want to take on the job. Joe Rogan, you can't publish this disinformation over here because he wants to make Rogan and it's 11 people. Now, if he does, that's fine, but in that case, you just flat out say so. He hiding around these keywords to avoid taking responsibility for this is the ethics that our platform.
we have to have some.
He doesn't want to do that.
And I think that is very problematic at best.
Now, here's my go. That is well worth looking up. Doing sort of a recounting of how Eck
There was one very telling paragraph in the Wall Street,
I think, says a lot. Called values.
Spotify tried to
You started into your second point. So can you start there?
Sure. So my second point is really about the perils of speak up culture at a company, which I think are and
time. The Wall Street Journal had a great article about a week ago recreating
of
how
diverse,
Spotify,
and they included
a link paragraph about the internal culture at Spotify. And
I'd like to
sentences
here.
I promise I'll be brief.
But
This is what the Wall Street Journal said. Spotify tries to foster an egalitarian culture
and encourages employees to openly debate topics as diverse as an app update, the snacks available in the office, other things like that. Since Mr. addition to Spotify
20,
some employee
message board about his
shows. And what that really caught my eye about was that the internal subculture senior employees, senior executives like to foster it about operational issues. You want employees to speak up about app updates and whether they're worth it, whether they're correct. I think a lot of CEOs would say that's cool. That's what we want. You want what snacks we have in the office fridge and what gets delivered on Friday afternoons. That's great. But now
are taking it
on themselves.
Well, if I'm speaking out about operational issues,
While I'm at it, I'm about the company's
priorities.
too, because I see that we're dealing with this third party here.
If I had Joe Rogan,
At
your business, it might be somebody else.
But they're starting to speak up more vociferously about ethical priorities at a company. And I think that is a point that a lot of corporate executives have been prepared.
We saw it a
lot with companies that engaged with the administration, say around immigrant detention. How many times did we see headlines about employees being up in arms that they had business the immigration services or business control, things like that? They were so we see this treachery.
I think maybe Daniel Ek is
not.
They want employees to speak up about the easy operational stuff, but yet they're not thrilled when they speak up about the ethical stuff.
And we don't want to do business with this third party over here. That is exactly what's happening with Spotify right now. And Ek is trying to have his. He's trying to say we're just a platform company. We are not responsible for how third parties use our product. That's Uber platform company. They absolutely are responsible for how drivers might use their product. That is why they have lengthy background checks with the driver. Uber. Everything that he, how
role to be a censor, as I said, censorship in corporate business. But he says it's not.
Call him. Do a quick thought experiment. Wherever we talk about anti-vax, substitute the word Holocaust denier. It's not our
really pass judgment on people
interviewing Holocaust deniers. That's a nobody is going to say that Spotify's measures that they're using for Rogan, like including a content advisory and pointing to a fact about vaccinations. If we try those things for Holocaust denial, we'd get laughed into the street because that's preposterous. Holocaust denial should not be tolerated at all. And we would all say that. And we would all have measures don't cut it either. Get rid of those people from our extended enterprise. We all will. So really, clearly there is an ethical line here, and Ek just doesn't want to draw it. I think personally that yes, anti-vaccination also should not be tolerated on platform business, but Ek is trying to make that judgment at all, and finding that ethical alignment with where his employees and his customers' priorities are. That's the sort of time. In the 2020s,
Disney again.
they're probably going to learn the hard way. So, Tom, I'll stop there and say I do get pretty animated about this because Ek is just trying to abdicate the ethical choice that he has to make as a CEO. That is your job. And he doesn't want to do it because it's a lot of money if he doesn't do it. And he's doing all these dodge and weave games.
So, Matt, is there any regulatory body, public group, other set of stakeholders that can influence CEO Ek, or is because of the nature of Spotify, it's really immune to outside pressures on this issue?
Well, I think, I would be hard pressed to see where
there's a real regulatory effort here because that does get into censorship. I think that. But the stakeholder groups who would matter, employees, customer, other business partners like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and various other people who have been pulling their music, they all matter. You wonder if
Rogan
now,
would some
shareholder
litigation against
companies
saying, why did
you not think this through beforehand? And perhaps that, if Daniel Ek retreats at this moment, would he face any sort of shareholder derivative litigation that company didn't do its ethical due diligence on Joe Rogan? That's a possibility. Clearly, we need to think through what are ethical standards for whether they are customers, whether they're platform users, they're content providers, whatever you want to call it. I don't think it makes a distinction. I don't think it makes a difference. These debates can then happen very quickly and very publicly if you're not prepared for it. And clearly Spotify wasn't, because here we are with this mess.
Wait.
All right.
So now we're on to fan favorites, shout outs and rants. Karen Woody, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
Well, I was going to have a rant against Spotify, but Matt has covered the waterfront on that. I'm so happy that he did. So I'm going to give a shout out to whoever it was who lined up the Super Bowl halftime show. And that is a shout out on behalf of everyone who is my age and within, shooting distance of a decade up. I just think it's finally that the marketers have realized that all of us in our 40s are a huge demographic. So that's why they put on Eminem, Snoop Dogg, Mary J. Blige. It is like my high school best hits are coming back for this Super Bowl. No shade against The Weeknd, because last year's show was great, but I appreciate that we're going like a full throwback to the 90s for this Super Bowl's halftime show. I cannot wait.
Jay Rosen.
So this shout out goes to my favorite celebrity chef who is always there when there's a natural disaster. Jose Andres tweeted, and I'll read, "Dear at Rep MTG," who's Marjorie Taylor Greene, "the gazpacho police was created by me in 1993 to make sure that no one would add Tabasco or jalapeno or strange things to my beloved soup. Please don't blame anybody else but me, but stop by for a glass anytime. But don't forget your mask and vaccination card." Mic drop.
Jonathan Marks.
So big shout out to wearing my red today for the Philadelphia 76ers for dumping that bum Ben Simmons, who collected gazillions of dollars while sitting around not playing basketball. Ben, I hope your head's getting well. That there's no shame in going through that process, but the fact and the way you handled yourself, I think you need a new agent. I'll give you my phone number if you want to get a hold of me. You can look me up on my website at Baker Tilly, but you need better representation in the future, my friend, because you burned a lot of bridges.
Matt Kelly.
I'm going to give a shout out that apparently law enforcement agency we have never heard of in this country before now, the National, for leading what was reported as a raid against Mar-a-Lago that former President Trump apparently took from the White House. I have heard of many different agencies raids and executing search warrants and things like that. The National Archives on my of agencies that might wind up showing up at your house to take documents and cart them out. And a bonus shout out to New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman, who has another Trump administration book coming out, including the allegation that they had to get plumbers to come to the White House. That apparently President really flushed White House toilet. I am probably not the first person to have said for many years that Donald Trump was trying to flush the Constitution down the toilet. He meant that as a figurative thing. Maybe I'm not clear on that. I'd also love to know who that had to show up and do that. And by the way, just out of curiosity, what do they charge? Because they're outrageous around here in Boston. But that is my shout out to at least some agency out there that is really grabbing the bull by the horns and trying to enforce accountability. So shout out to the National Archives. Who knew?
Toilet paper shortage in the early part of the pandemic. It was a real thing. I'm going to have a melancholy shout out today, and that is to the University of Michigan School of Law and the greater law educational profession, who lost two giants this week, both of whom were professors at U of M when I was there. The first is Yale Camazar. Yale Camazar was truly a force of nature. He literally invented criminal procedural rights prior to going to trial. He was a key component of the Supreme Court's decision in Gideon versus Wainwright, but he's even more well known as really the father of the Miranda rights. So Yale Camazar, a truly great in criminal procedure, but also Terence Sandalo. He was the dean of the University of Michigan School of Law when I was there, and he was a very different professor than Yale Camazar. He was very cerebral. He was a constitutional specialist. I took him for 14th Amendment, and I know this will resonate with the true geeks out there. If you can tie the slaughterhouse cases from the 1870s to the constitutional revolution of the 1930s up until the time I took constitutional law in 1980s, you're a brilliant professor. So we lost two greats, Terence Sandalo and Yale Camazar. I'm sure you're up there debating in that great moot court in the sky. Ladies and gentlemen, in spite of our technical difficulties, another great episode, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks so much.